This is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And
I'm Bill Saylor, today sitting on the board for Dave Watani, who's got the weekend off, but he's plenty busy, so he asked me to help out today. This is your weekly discussion of things environmental through the eyes and ears of Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, whether it's on your local streetscape or cultural history or a mix of all sorts of things.
Well, firstly, I'd like to add a little to the Bernadine Stake passing. She was kind of a very energized person. Grew up in Nebraska, near to Indian reserves. Indians hadn't been totally moved out, and a small community. Became a one-teacher school teacher straight out of high school. So over the years has been a teacher of note. Got a doctorate and married Bob Stake, who is a curriculum developer of note, and came to Champaign-Urbana in the 60s and settled in a house just opposite Carl Park, which became her environment for a long time. On the city council for best part of 20 years, on the planning commission after that, friend to lots of people, and a participant in organizations, including our own Heartland Pathways. And so her involvement allowed the sort of thing that this week we heard that the Monticello City has gotten 145,000 to pave part of the trail is on the Heartland Pathways corridor. It wouldn't be there if people like Bernadine hadn't been on a board. Dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, host of many different organizations, children, grandchildren, and doing interesting things. One I was talking to is working with the preservation of California condors. Was chair of a unit. Her church was the Unitarian Church, where she was a leader, and chair of a red herring, which is a spin-off from the red herring. Yes, Channy Murray, and but the ceremonies of memorial were interesting, but by what was a number of different people there, and the family had organized a very informal goodbye. Then I want to say something about the organizations one gets involved with. This has been Earth Week, and Arbor Day was Friday. We don't necessarily ourselves get involved in one-day events that might pass into the future without continuance. Because our environmental involvement is perennial, and that this last couple of weeks was filled with information. The Grand Prairie Friends had a spring meeting, and it was oriented to cicadas and bumblebees. Cobb and Dana, two women working with these creatures. We have to deal with a change in mission to some extent. The Grand Prairie Friends has morphed into forest, so they changed the constitution to instead of being prairie, which was the original intent, it now includes forests under the term of nature. I was forced to say something about that because long before there was a Grand Prairie Friends, Bob Dodd, attorney and long-term member of the city council and mayor of Champaign, was our pro bono lawyer, and we had a lot of debate as to whether we should create a Grand Prairie Friends and whether I, as an interested party, should be on the board. We had a difference of opinion. I felt I didn't want to breathe down our new group's neck, and so we I opted to not be on that board, and I'm glad. Like on many of the other things we do, it's inspirational and innovative, and often the groups continue for many years and do a better job than we could do when we're spread too thin. The Grand Prairie Friends has done very well. They have 100 acres now, mainly in Coles County, but they still have prairies at Loader and Bonnie's Prairie and Prospect and other places. So we encourage them in what they're doing and applaud their leadership. It's not easy to do these things, but sometimes they can take off, and they have done very well, and now are a trust, and they sit on state boards, and so I enjoyed being there, even if I want to press the issue of prairie preservation, where there has been, when we started it, no legal preservation agency that spoke for prairie, and we know it is very hard to do. The only prairie that's left is along railroad beds, and they're hard to work with, and so there's not a lot of opportunity, but we still need to work at it. Later in the week, the Grand Prairie Friends had their own board meeting. I went to that because I'm interested in a potential trail between Kankakee and Rantoul. I would like to see that strip annotated with parking places here and there, with the opportunity for people to understand that what they're driving past is not just a bunch of weeds, and then to have them stop off at places like Loader and Paxton, and from Paxton down to Rantoul, there's extra space of a dual highway that didn't get built because 57 went in. There's an old interurban. There's an old concrete 45, which was going to be replaced by a highway, and one leg did get to be done like that. This could be a bicycle trail and a hike trail, and also a stop-off for traffic. Much of the north-south traffic is on 57, so this is a modestly dense highway, and it continues through. It goes over the Bloomington Moraine. There's a moraine at Paxton. It goes down to a outwash Plain Creek, which is traditional of this sort of geology of continental glaciation. Then it gets to Ludlow and gradually moves up to the Bloomington Moraine, which is both Bloomington and Paxton are reasonably high. At Paxton, they used to have to put a pusher engine on freight trains to get them over the hill, so they burrowed a cutting through that moraine, and the soil that came down to Champaign and raised the railroad bed up so that we could have underpasses. As you go past Ludlow, which is a nice little historic town, which was the terminus of the Illinois Central for a while it was being built south in the 1850s, I think. Then you gradually get to the Bloomington Moraine. It has soft glacial till, so rich soils covered with the loess blown across the country. So you have dryness on the top, and the same liatris plant may be 6 inches high, whereas in a wet situation it might be 3 feet high. It reminds me to say that if we brought people, visitors, interested parties off of 57 at Kankakee, they could also move east or west and check out the dunes that came when the glaciers, the world warmed and the glaciers retreated, and the meltways with their sand and gravel, the heavier particles were blown across the state, and they fell out near the Illinois River. But there are sand dunes in Iroquois County that could be visited from Kankakee. There's an area in there that's interesting. That historically, some of the French people that were escaping from Canada, some were Cajuns and went to New Orleans or in the south, but some came to Illinois at L'Arabe and places like just in the area very near to where these sand dunes are, and the sandy soils encourage a different spectrum of prairie plants. So you get a little of that on the top of the Bloomington Moraine, and then you go down, you get mesic plants and wetland, and you have outwash Plain creeks. I'm looking for how we might be able to encourage that concept of a state or national park. And most of, or a lot of the corridor, the right-of-ways, are owned by the Department of Transportation, and it is covered to some extent with invasive species like teasel and autumn olive, but with a little tender loving care, this could be improved. I'm a little cautious of pollinator people who might find this to be something other than a remnant prairie, and perhaps with the addition of cultivated species, that could be a difficulty. So I spoke to that at the Grand Prairie Friends meeting. But Jamie Ellis is president, and on the next day, the Grand Prairie, the Natural Areas Study Group was going to Brownfield Woods, and I had been involved with Brownfield Woods as I went along, and And it was a very nice field trip. It was more challenging than most people like to think of. These days, ecologists encourage people to walk through the prairie rather than to make an alligator trail. And that was how the field trip was run. There was an associate, forgetting his name at the moment, it might be Nelson, but they worked together and look at the forest as to whether it was you just leave it alone or whether you manage it. And the university acquired Brownfield Woods in 1939, and the present standing is working through the Committee on Natural Areas out of the Graduate College. There's a push to manage the woods so that some of the older trees get saved from perhaps falling trees. That there is flooding because areas to the north are fairly almost eroded, but there's a lot of runoff there, and it comes through Brownfield Woods. And so if you let the water go through Brownfield Woods fast, then there's people on the south who are not excited about that because they get more water. So you have to think about this little 65 acres, and I have to be pleased with the Natural Areas Study Group, which after many years, our docent group, it goes to local natural areas and reports on them, gets to have specialists like Jamie to come in and discuss the features of the natural area, and they do this once every week. And one of the coming up programs will be go to Coles County to see what's going on there. They usually take their lunch and stop off afterwards, and it's sort of a friendly affair. But that sort of thing adds to what we do and extends it. I think they all enjoyed. There were about 20 people there, mostly from Grand Prairie Friends or the Natural Areas Study Group or the Master Naturalists. There's a plant sale, and the Grand Prairie Friends runs that. It's on May the 11th. You need to get there early if you want to have special plants, because they go fairly quickly. And I have a notice here. Where do we have? I think it is a plant sale. It's 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. So if you go at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you will miss this. There will still be backloading plants that haven't sold yet, but
where is it?
It's in Lincoln Square Mall, and it's an annual sale, and they add on some other groups like herb people and bonsai people. So it's a big sale, and lots of people there, and gradually people are getting to be more interested in planting nature and also planting pollinator species. So there'll be some people there. We have to warn people that if you're doing prairie planting, you need total light. So if you have a backyard that you think you might be able to put in the prairie, you have to pick those species that tolerate a little bit of shade. Like Joe Pye weed you would find normally on an edge timber where there was some shade. But if it's too shady in your backyard, the perennial plants will become annual plants, and you'll have to plant them each year. The plants are better than seed. Seed for many species is long term. So you really have to label the spot you put them in, because you can't remember where you put them. But you can sort yourself out a nice little prairie in the front yard. It can only be as little as 10 by 10 and have 15 species in it. And then you interpret that to others. And so in the Chicago area especially, there's been a big move to put in pollinator plots, and across the nation and across the world to some extent, it's realized that much of your vegetables pollinated. And if you're in California and you need nuts or other things that need to be pollinated, you have to hire a trailer load of bees to help you do that. So we haven't got to be that stage now, but we're losing pollinators in the form of bumblebees, which are very muscular. They get into flowers and have strong shoulders, and they get themselves covered with pollen and take it to and pollinate a new flower elsewhere. And they're not the Italian bee, which is has a hive and it's convenient for us because we can centrifuge the honey combs and produce honey more easily than you can't do that with a bumblebee, because it finds a little nest in the ground under some litter and is rather more independent. They get together, but not the same way as the Italian bee. So I think that gets, once again, if you miss me, May the 11th, it's a Saturday, 8 a.m. to 1 p.m.
That's the Grand Prairie Friends plant sale.
Yes.
Native plant sale. And as you said, combined with other organizations. With
Yes.
other plants.
Well,
y'all are tuned to the Prairie Monk Show on WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM. That's Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk. Today is April 28th. Sound about
yes,
right?
April
Sunday,
28th.
April 28th, 2019.
So I'm going fairly quickly because time goes quickly. I went to the forest reserve because I'm concerned about the width of the trail that is the Kickapoo Trail. Heartland Pathways had a lot to do with this trail. They took out their initial agreement with the Federal Surface Transportation Board. The trail is using bicycles and hikers and preservationists to save railroad beds, which, if they were to be replaced in years to come, would be very costly to replace. You can imagine if they go to a place like St. Joe and would have to buy back real estate to put in a railroad, it would be impossible. So they're prepared to contribute money for development. They call it enhancement. And Heartland Pathways had already purchased 33 miles of railbed in the Monticello area, so we had some experience. We also knew a lot about the biology in the area between Urbana and Danville, and we were aware, especially, that there was strip mining, and strip mine ponds vary according to their age. So a fairly recent strip mine pond might have 2 or 3 species and lots of them, but if you went to a 75-year-old pond, you would have fewer species and a bigger range. So there's biodiversity there. People like Shelford and Kendi and Vestal did research on this sort of thing, and it's a very good demonstration of how landscape can return to nature. There's lots of sulfur in the soil, so it's not easy to bring back nature. But the regulations behind strip mining indicate that you should plant trees. Sometimes they're 2 inches, 2 feet tall, and they don't always grow. But there's an attempt to revitalize those strip mines. So this trail goes between Urbana and Danville. The first 7 miles is in action. It's been built, but its width is so wide that it takes out all the prairie right away on either side. And a little piece between Urbana and Mount Olive Cemetery at Mayview was rich in prairie, and there's been some road development there, so this is not always, the loss of prairie is not always only related to the trail. But you have to know that the trail is put together largely to encourage recreation, and so there's a challenge between recreation and conservation. The Forest Preserve is mandated to do preservation as well as recreation, and they're very good at doing this. They've been planting prairies, but they're also planting trees, and Champaign County was 94% prairie. So if you want to save your ecosystem that was heritaged here, it is prairie. So I spoke to that a little and begged that the next phase would be narrower. If we go to Oakwood, where Doris Westfield's collected seed, but a lot of other people have collected seed on a 1.5 mile section there. If that gets to be a wide trail, then you take out a large percentage of the prairie that's been saved. We're talking about remnant prairie, not reconstruction prairie. Remnant prairie has been around since the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago. So they're dynamic. They're not the same as they move through the centuries, but it's then it involves the microorganisms that you don't find in a farmer's field that's been fertilized and chemicalized, and it's mostly along railroads because by happenstance the railroads have laws that say that you can't invade, and therefore the native land that the railroad was put through on a linear manner. The right-of-ways on either side are representative of prairie soils, if nothing else, but often there are species there too. It's not easy to do this sort of work, so there is a need for people who have a legal background, that have a biological background, and have some leadership potential to bring together volunteers who will know enough to be able to argue the point. So what do we do with the Kickapoo Trail? It's 10 foot wide, but actually it's more than that. The trail itself is capped. That means the creosote that's in ties that have been removed, leftover creosote might invade our soles. And then there's a berm down on either side, and that is also capped. By the time you've done with that, you have a wild trail with not very much habitat on either side. There's also a tendency to mold the corridor. If you're going to change the drainage, if you're going to work with the development of a trail, it's much cheaper to put in a bulldozer with a laser beam on it and have it disturb the soil and then resculpt it. So you're giving back a soil that is very, very disturbed. It is much more expensive to sit on the side with a high hoe and say, if you only need to take out 4 inches here, you take out 4 inches and you leave the soil undisturbed. And that's often important for prairie preservation. The disturbed soil encourages weeds, and unfortunately, when the area is planted, often it is planted with fertilizer, and so if we're doing that ourselves and we know better, we give that fertilizer away, because the prairie does quite well with its own soil. It doesn't need the fertilizer. The weeds do tremendously well with a little bit of fertilizer and a little bit of moisture, and off they go. So some of that area is being assigned to reconstruction prairie. Reconstruction prairie is a help. It allows people who are driving on the road next door to see what a prairie is like. It preserves some of the dignity of the more rough, tough prairie plants, but it doesn't have the biodiversity of a remnant prairie. And so, as you go from St. Joe, on the east side of St. Joe, there was very good prairie, and it has been mown because it's a subdevelopment on the other side, which is huge. And so we're hoping that subdevelopment will enjoy a native prairie and not criticize it as being an unmown, unneat syndrome. So then you get to a S-shaped bridge, and that is, you stand on that, you can see the railroad, an interurban, a road, and I'm hoping that the few plants that are along there that are prairie and all the soils there's a word called compromise. The state has managed to preserve 0.01% of its remnant prairie. This was two-thirds of the state was prairie, and so this is sort of endangered territory. And if you run along adjacent to your prairie, do we want to be responsible for taking out a huge gulp of the only remaining heritage prairie we have? So it's not impressive. It's hard to find the creatures because they've been mown in many cases. But that's what I wanted to talk about at the Forest Preserve. One of the responses was that there are rules of the game. There's ADA, which is American Disabilities Act, and the ADA people with wheelchairs love the wide trail, and so bicycles love it too. In fact, if you're walking along that, the corridor of 7 miles that's been completed so far is so popular that you might have a bicycle just runs past you at 30 miles an hour. It's almost a corridor for people to use St. Joe as a bedroom community and then come through on a bicycle to work. So we're watching this and hoping that when you get to Ogden, you're getting more towards the Danville end, and you don't really need a super wide corridor that takes out the heritage that you have. Each of those little communities needs a prairie, because you don't necessarily, they're not going to go off to Manhattan and visit a 1,000 acres of prairie. They're going to have a little piece outside territory.
Manhattan, Kansas, that is.
That's it?
Manhattan, Kansas, that is.
Yes, yes. Bill Savina. And it's a big area. The federal government has decided they were losing prairie. In fact, they were. Most every prairie plot is rich in soil and is good for agriculture. The Flint Hills of Kansas were just a little hard to dig up, so they have been used by livestock to some extent. But you can go to Kansas where they have buffalo, and you can hear wolves howling. You can have experimental work, and it's rather wonderful to know that there is a large place. The railroad beds are not the most ideal. They're just what we have left. If you have a railroad line, it can go straight, and you can get a fox that can go along and get the Franklin ground squirrels all the way along. It's often a corridor with power lines that have to be maintained, and if trees are there, then you get it herbicided, so your broadleaf plants don't survive. You have sometimes two lines on the corridor. You have an adjacent interurban. We don't always know who owns what. So there's a lot of legal digging and putting that we will ask for if we asked. And who do you ask? I called the Surface Transportation Board in Washington, and they took a day or so to find the details of our first application for the Kickapoo Trail. And they said, no, we don't worry. We know we want to preserve the corridors. We just don't want a highway through a line that might come back to a railroad. But we don't set the specifications for the width of the trail. So then you have to figure out whether this is going to be state, or is it local, or is it the planner or the implementer or the Department of Transportation that is in control, and how do you make that contact? Often the detail for planning is farmed out, so you have to find the group. In this case, the Farnsworth Company, which is a big company that does very good work on rail trails through urban sites and is familiar with what the recreation people want. But you have to also know that most of the associates that are doing that sort of work are concerned with recreation, and they're engineers, and engineers don't necessarily have a lot of biology or sociology to know that there are other things. So then there's risk. So how do you balance the risks between the creosote that might be there after 100 years and leaks into the soil, and the prairie that is non-existent, almost? So there is some risk that we have in society. We have to think about it. And so when you're talking to ADA, American Disabilities Act, and EPA, you're challenging established political statements. So that means we may even have to be in Springfield talking to political people, or we may be having to talk to Farnsworth Group or to the Forest Preserve. The Forest Preserve was a spin-off from George Feld coming back from creating the Nature Conservancy in Washington. He encouraged boards there that decided they wanted to preserve the dignity of a site on Long Island, and George was a stickler for having chapters throughout the country. So even though he'd founded this group, he lost out and so came back to Illinois. One of the things he did was to put together a forest preserve. And the forest preserve got through the government, but only just. And one of the things was that they wanted to make sure that the recreators were involved. So the forest preserve has a mandate for recreation as well as for preservation. It's up to the forest preserve to do things. We tried to get a new organization which would have the involvement of the royal opposition, of farmers who would like to use the corridors for a few more rows of corn and soybeans, the biologists, the engineers, and sensibly, most of these sorts of organizations now have a CEO. So Grand Prairie Friends, for instance, has a CEO. The other groups do too, and there's a lot of work here. And it also requires people getting to know. And we've been lucky that our Tucker has come along, and he has been looking at us, and he said, you have 200 more programs up on YouTube, but people don't really use YouTube. You also have about 500 friends on Facebook. Let's get these into a media. Zuckerberg has been getting some criticism for lack of privacy, but still the social media has been letting people know about each other, and it has its good and not so good advantages. So we've put stuff up on Facebook that is telling people it's more than just us reading who is responding to us, but it's putting information out there. And we did this on Earth Week, and amazingly we got responses from that already. And I went to a party last night, and people had already been reading the blog that we have. So we have to have people who are knowledgeable, often young people who do that. And the young people are not going to have the resources that their grandparents had. So let's activate that sort of thing. And art is on the right wavelengths. So we have to tell people what we have done in the past, like not only Prairie, but we moved a little Greek Revival cottage, which is now the Park District headquarters in Nevada. There's a whole bunch of things that we need to let people know about, and we've been doing fairly silently. At one stage, we didn't announce where the prairies were because, frankly, there were people who knew enough to be dangerous, and they could go out and dig up a gentian plant and not know that it would be hard for it to survive. But it also, we knew that we only had 10 plants, and so we were very cautious about getting the geographers to make maps that would allow people to go to places. But now it's getting to the point where we have to be more public, and we have to let people know what we're doing. It's like if you were making movie pictures and you never distributed them, then nobody would ever know what you have. But if you do distribute them, then you're going to have to battle of whether you have English pictures or American pictures. If you're Australian, can you have Australian pictures? So you have to do that sort of work, and it's very, very taxing. But we beg volunteers to come by and do that sort of work. Peter Miller came by. Peter Miller has a PhD in physics, but morphed into that labor and industrial relations. And he interestingly knew a labor and industrial relation person who bought the depot at Fithian. and eventually he sold it to local educators who have treated it very well, and it is an icon on our Kickapoo Trail. So that sort of friendship comes by. Peter was here with his son Noah. They are in Maine, and we're here for just 12 hours, meeting up with people on WEFT, where Peter was at one stage on the air.
Helped steer the ship.
So, yeah.
With Zach Miller, who we call the Miller brothers. They weren't brothers, but brothers in arms.
So, so that sort of thing is interesting, and it keeps us together. Let me see what else.
So y'all are tuned to WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM. This is the Prairie Monk program. By the way, how can people find you on Facebook? How are you presenting yourself?
The Prairie Monk.
Prairie Monk.
And you put the article in front. The is helpful. The Prairie Monk, and you can get YouTube, or you can get now we have a line where you can go for a blog. We need to put up some of our history so you know about. But Bill has been very good on this. He's been co-host for many years,
and not for many years. So
yes,
I have some
so
of the
David
archive.
has been doing it recently, but
I have some of the archive, and I hope there'll be a surviving mini disc machine in 10 or 20 years.
Yes, that's the
I
problem.
bought one of the last portable models, but it just did not have the robustness of the previous ones. We still have them around here, though. Well, if you're looking, I have an announcement.
Yes.
Champaign City Council has a special study session this Tuesday. Their meetings are on Tuesday. They alternate between study sessions, which are not voting, usually discussion, and then voting meetings. And it's a fifth Tuesday. I presume that's maybe why it's a special one this week. April 30th, 7 p.m., downtown Champaign City Council chambers. Well, the topic of discussion at this meeting is the proposed ice rink development for downtown near the train, the new fairly recent train station, which would be part of this redevelopment.
Leaving the Inman Hotel, but
there's nothing too special about the land use that's there now. Most of it's been retired, partly in anticipation of something else.
Mostly it's vacant at the moment.
Yeah.
They're looking for something like $19 million to do this.
So, if you want to hear part of the story, that's going to be talked about Tuesday evening, 7 p.m., City Council chambers. I kind of ran into this because I was looking for the marathon route map, and I went to the city webpage, which I didn't find it there, but right there on the city homepage, City of Champaign, is a news link, and this is listed as, this is happening this week. And then if you open it, you can open an agenda for the meeting, and it says this is what it is. And then on the agenda, there's also a link to a rather large staff memo, in which, if you're interested in the details, you can open the memo and see.
Sometimes they may be 60 pages.
Yeah.
You can find what they're going to talk about.
You see the council packet, and it's already there, and it's a summary of what they've talked about so far and what the issues are at the moment. So that's all available to you on the City of Champaign website.
So the intent is to have the university establish a ice hockey team. The intent is to have a building that's venue inviting. That means it would seat perhaps 1,000 or more people. So if it's not a ice rink, it's a venue that allows the city to attract people who want to have conferences. At the moment, they have to be in little hotels dotted around, but if you had a bigger hotel and it had a major focal point and MTD is involved, then you're likely to be able to invite conferences. And that's the overall objective of this.
Do we need a hockey team? That's one way to pay for it, right? That's somebody's idea.
So there's been several attempts to develop. So if you want to go to this, you go to the meeting and then you can speak, or you can listen on
see the agenda here
on your computer.
Audience participation after the presentation, after the update.
So
Bloomington already has one of these, by the way. They have concerts and stuff.
Well,
it's not necessarily the same rank of hockey, if you will, to my understanding.
We're getting gentrification. It's coming back from the malls. The malls are empty, and there's been some sessions about how we preserve the dignity of Marketplace Mall.
Well, the last renovation Marketplace Mall made it look like a downtown on the inside.
Yes. So I went to the Tuesday meeting, and Tuesday meeting was dealing with recycling.
Oh.
We have functional reuse or functional obsolescence. And we have all this technology which gives us television sets that are not single narrow gauge. They have a little bit of precious metals. So they've had, the state has supported, EPA has supported various communities to have a day. Sometimes they're a few years apart. You might have a center like Danville having it at one stage. And so I think there are 4 of them in the state this year, and Champaign has one of them. One of the questions was, it's changed its style. It used to be you have to line up, and there was about 2 miles of cars, and I have a little CRX, but it doesn't like to be started every 2 minutes, so you move a little bit further. So by the time I got to the dump center where you took your electronics, it was boiling. So
you had to hand in the whole car.
I got promptly moved out of the line, and there are things like you can take some of your chemicals, and there was a big tub, and all the chemicals went into the big tub, and I thought that many of these chemicals could be sorted, but there is some question that not everyone is getting rid of their obsolete equipment, and so there's been more semis lined up to take materials, and so people haven't registered. So to avoid having this line of cars, you now get an appointment, and you get to come in at a certain time, and you don't have to wait in a big line. That big line, just the churning over of engines, is an environmental nightmare. So I was listening there, and I'm interested. Over the last 20 years or so, I have probably taken out of dumpsters and gondolas. A gondola is a big son of a gun dumpster, and it's usually used by developers. And I would salvage things like a 20-foot 2x12 that had a little bit of a curl in it. So it's not ideal, but gosh, there's a lot of wood in that. And there's cardboard I've taken out and put outside, left mounds of cardboard that have been recycled. And not everyone likes that because it doesn't look good to have a pile of garbage outside, but it can be reused. I've taken a wheelchair that was in the dumpster that I took it to the rehab people that sent it off to Africa where they send leftover wheelchairs. There are bicycles.
Hammond, Oregon, that came out of the Stevic Center or something, and it just wasn't going to come out of the dumpster on our own power.
Yes. And lots of plastic. And I had to say that the architects are not designing a bar so that it has different plots, so that you have glass in one. We're running out of sound, so in 50 years' time we may be salvaging glass or cans or real garbage. it all goes into the one bag at the moment. And so just a little bit of reform at the rules and regulations behind architecture would give us a bar that had an ability to sort. And then there's some education. Just down the road we have a cardboard dumpster, but there's a tendency to just shove cardboard in without flattening it. And so that cardboard dumpster gets full and then blows around the street. So I'm watching, and so a little education to the people who put cardboard in as to please to break it up in the first place, not have a big box that's not broken up, and then put your garbage in carefully. I go to the comic strip up the road and take cardboard boxes, which I think should be returned to the agency, but it doesn't happen. And so I take those boxes to books for prisoners. So I'm looking at the time. We have 2 minutes left. So I think I want you to be involved. It's not just Arbor Day on Friday. It's Earth Day on Monday and the week following. It's a lifetime, and if we don't watch the climate, we'll have the world in a mess, and we have to think about what we do to stabilize places like the Arctic and Antarctic, which are melting at a very, very, very rapid rate. So,
Well, that would just about do it. We can end at noon if we do it now.
yes. This has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
I'm Bill Saylor, sitting in for Dave Witzani, engineering the show today, such as it is. A little slide here, a little slide there, but good to be back visiting Dave this week.